The spring of 1962 came early to Pearson County, Georgia. The dogwoods bloomed 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and the red clay roads dried out before Easter, which the old-timers said was either a blessing or a warning. Most years they couldn't tell the difference until it was too late. Harold Grady was 41 years old that spring, and he had been keeping bees on his 180-acre farm since he was 19. His grandfather had taught him. His grandfather's grandfather had taught the man before that. The Grady family had always kept bees the way some families kept faith, quietly, consistently, without needing anyone else to understand why. Harold's hives sat at the eastern edge of his property, along a tree line of longleaf pine and sweet gum that separated his land from the county road. He had 32 hives that spring, white painted boxes, arranged in 4 neat rows, each one sitting on a cedar post his father had cut and cured himself. Harold walked those rows every morning before breakfast, a worn leather notebook in his left hand, a stubby pencil tucked behind his ear. He didn't wear gloves. He never had. The notebook was his grandfather's originally. Brown leather cover, corners worn soft as skin, spine held together with a strip of cotton twine. Harold had replaced 3 times over the years. Inside were 22 years of observations, temperature readings, queen behavior, brood patterns, honey yields measured to the half-pound. His wife Clara had once called it the most boring book ever written. Harold had laughed and said that was exactly the point. What Harold had noticed over the past 18 months was something the notebook couldn't fully explain yet. His colonies were changing. Not dying, changing. The bees were faster, more defensive, smaller in body but somehow more efficient. His honey yield per hive had jumped from 62 pounds annually to 91 pounds. The comb architecture was tighter, the foraging radius wider. He had never introduced new queens. He had never purchased new stock. He didn't know it yet, but what was happening in his hives along that Georgia tree line was part of something much larger. In 1957, a Brazilian geneticist named Warwick Kerr had accidentally released a strain of African honeybees from a research facility outside Sao Paulo. Those bees had been moving north ever since, crossing borders, crossbreeding with domestic colonies, producing hybrids that were faster, stronger, and considerably less tolerant of interference. By 1962, the first rumors of so-called Africanized bees had reached American agricultural journals. By 1963, those rumors would reach Pearson County in the worst possible way. But that spring, Harold Grady only knew what his notebook told him. His bees were thriving. His yields were climbing. And every morning he walked those 4 rows of white boxes with his stubby pencil and his worn leather notebook, writing down what he saw, trusting what 22 years had taught him. The county around him had other opinions forming, quietly at first, then louder. Clyde Merritt, Harold's nearest neighbor and oldest friend, stopped by the eastern fence one Tuesday morning in late April. Clyde was a broad-shouldered man who farmed soybeans and asked few questions, which was why Harold trusted him. "You hear what they're saying in town?" Clyde said, leaning on the fence post. Harold didn't look up from his notebook. "I hear a lot of things in town." "They're saying your bees stung Earl Putnam's boy last week," said the boy ran half a mile before they quit chasing him. Harold wrote down a temperature reading. "Earl Putnam's boy threw a rock at a hive. I watched him do it from the porch." Clyde was quiet for a moment. "Still," he said, "people are talking." Harold closed his notebook and looked at the hives. The morning sun was catching the pine tree line, and the air in front of the boxes was alive with movement. Thousands of small bodies moving in patterns that looked like chaos but weren't. "Let them talk," Harold said. He tucked the pencil behind his ear and walked back toward the house. He had not yet understood that the talking had already reached Preston Ashford's ears, and Preston Ashford did not merely talk. Preston Ashford owned the Pearson County Savings and Trust, a 2-story brick building on Main Street in Boston that had been in his family since 1909. He also owned 1,100 acres of farmland across 3 counties, a cotton gin operation, and a controlling interest in the only grain elevator within 30 miles. He was 54 years old, silver-haired, and wore linen suits in summer that he had pressed every Monday morning by a woman named Grady, who came to his house specifically for that purpose. Preston Ashford had never kept bees. He had never kept anything that he couldn't put a dollar value on inside of 60 days. He considered patience a virtue of men who lacked options. The first time he addressed Harold Grady publicly was on the morning of May 14, 1962, inside the Boston Farm Bureau meeting hall, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of cigarette smoke and folding chairs. 41 farmers had gathered for the monthly meeting. Dora Phelps sat in the 3rd row, a schoolteacher who attended every Farm Bureau meeting and wrote letters to the county paper. Silas Bowen sat near the back, a cattle farmer who chewed tobacco and rarely said anything but remembered everything. The regular agenda had barely started when Preston Ashford stood up without being recognized by the chair. "I think we need to talk about the Grady situation," he said. His voice was the kind that filled rooms without effort. Harold was sitting in the fifth row. He didn't turn around. "I've had 3 families come to me this week," Preston continued, addressing the room rather than Harold. 3 families whose children have been chased and stung by bees coming off the Grady property. Now, I'm not here to accuse anyone of negligence. He paused just long enough to make clear that he was doing exactly that. But I think we all know that Harold's been running something out there on that eastern tree line that doesn't belong in a county with children and livestock. The room was quiet. Harold's hand tightened slightly on his notebook, but he didn't open it. "Those are domestic colonies," Harold said, his voice even registered with the state. "Inspected last September." Preston turned to look at him for the first time. He smiled the way men smile when they've already decided the outcome of a conversation. "Harold," he said, "I say this with respect. A domestic bee doesn't chase a child for half a mile. A domestic bee doesn't put Earl Putnam's boy in the county clinic with 47 stings." He looked back at the room. "What Harold's got out there, gentlemen, are not domestic bees, and I think we all know it." Dora Phelps looked at Harold. She saw his jaw set, his eyes level, his hands still. She would write in her letter to the paper that week that Harold Grady had looked like a man standing in water that was rising very slowly and had decided to simply stand straighter. Silas Bowen shifted his tobacco to the other cheek and said nothing, but he watched Preston Ashford the way a man watches weather moving in from the west. Harold stood up. The room waited. "I'll have the state inspector out by the end of the month," Harold said. "If he finds anything irregular, I'll address it. That's all I've got to say." He sat back down. Preston Ashford smiled again. "That's very reasonable, Harold. Very reasonable." He let the word reasonable sit in the air like something slightly insulting, then he sat down and smoothed the front of his linen jacket. After the meeting in the gravel parking lot, Clyde Merritt fell into step beside Harold. "He's already decided something," Clyde said quietly. "I know," Harold said. "What are you going to do?" Harold looked out toward the road, in the direction of his farm, though it was 4 miles east and invisible from here. "Go home," he said. "Walk the rows. Write it down." He got in his truck. The leather notebook sat on the seat beside him, its cotton-twined spine pressed against his leg the whole drive home. The state inspector came on the 28th of May. His name was Walter Fenn, a thin man from the Atlanta office who wore a full beekeeper's suit, despite the heat, and carried a clipboard with a carbon copy form attached. He spent 2 hours at Harold's eastern tree line opening hives, examining brood frames, checking queen cells. Harold stood 10 feet back and watched. He wore no suit. He hadn't bothered with gloves since 1953. Walter Fenn came back to the fence line, sweating through his veil. He wrote something on his clipboard, tore off the carbon copy, and handed it to Harold without quite meeting his eyes. "Your colonies are registered and within legal parameters," Fenn said. "I can't cite you for anything present today." Harold read the form. "But?" Fenn clicked his pen twice. "There are characteristics in 2 of your colonies that are consistent with Africanized hybridization. Nothing definitive, nothing actionable, but I'd recommend you monitor them closely and report any behavioral escalation." "I've been monitoring them for 22 years, Harold said. "Yes, well," Fenn picked up his kit. "Keep doing that." He drove away in a state vehicle with a cracked windshield. Harold stood at the fence looking at his hives. The morning was warm and still, and the air in front of the white boxes moved with its usual ordered chaos. He went inside and found a fresh page in his notebook. At the top he wrote, May 28, 1962. State inspection complete. No citation. 2 colonies flagged for behavioral monitoring. Begin isolation protocol, hives 7 and 12. He underlined the last 4 words twice. 3 days later, Preston Ashford filed a formal complaint with the Pierson County Zoning Board. The complaint cited a county ordinance from 1931, an ordinance that had never been enforced, that most people didn't know existed, which stated that any apiary within a residential or agricultural community zone must be approved by the county board if it exceeded 20 colonies and had received any formal state inquiry. Harold had 32 colonies. He had received a state inquiry. Under the letter of the 1931 ordinance, he was technically in violation. Clyde Merritt drove over the morning. Harold received the zoning notice. He read it standing at the kitchen table, still holding his coffee cup. He dug up a 31-year-old ordinance, Clyde said. 31 years, Harold agreed. Nobody's ever used that ordinance. Nobody had to until now. Clyde set the notice down. What do you do with hives 7 and 12? Harold had already decided. I move them. Quarter-mile back from the tree line, behind the equipment shed. New enclosure, double-screen fence, separate observation log. He paused. And I reduce my count to 19 registered colonies. Clyde looked at him. You'd destroy 13 hives? I'd separate 13 hives, Harold said carefully. Store them behind the shed, off the registered count. Study them privately. He poured his coffee, folded the zoning notice into thirds, and put it in the drawer where he kept his tax documents. Then he went out to the eastern tree line with his notebook and began deciding which colonies to move and which to keep. He spent 4 hours making that decision. It was the most important 4 hours of the next decade, though he didn't know that yet. By July of 1962, Harold had reduced his registered count to 19 colonies along the eastern tree line and moved 13 hives, including numbers 7 and 12, behind the equipment shed. Set into a half-acre enclosure he built himself from cedar posts and double-layered wire mesh. He roofed the enclosure with shade cloth to reduce heat stress. He dug a small water channel along the southern edge fed by a gravity pipe from the upper field tank. Nobody in Pearson County knew the enclosure existed. It wasn't visible from the road. It wasn't on any county document. Harold didn't mention it to anyone except Clyde, and Clyde had the good sense to ask no questions. Every morning, Harold walked the eastern tree line first. Notebook, pencil, no gloves. He checked temperatures, brood patterns, honey weight on his hanging scale, a rusted iron thing his father had used to weigh catfish, now repurposed with a flat cedar board attached to the hook. 19 hives, 40 minutes. Then he went behind the equipment shed. The 13 hives in the enclosure were different. He knew that now with certainty. The inspection data Walter Fenn had given him, combined with 22 years of his own records, pointed to one conclusion: these colonies had hybridized. African genetics had entered his stock through natural crossbreeding, carried in by drones from some unknown source colony somewhere south or west of his property. The hybridization had produced bees that were, as the agricultural journals were beginning to say with increasing alarm, more aggressive, more defensive, and dramatically more productive. But Harold had noticed something the journals hadn't published yet. The venom yield per colony in hives 7 and 12 was nearly 3 times that of his standard domestic colonies, and the venom composition was different, thicker, more concentrated. When he'd accidentally pressed his bare forearm against a frame from hive 7 in June and taken a single sting, the welt had risen faster than any sting he'd felt in 40 years of beekeeping. It had also faded faster, completely gone in 18 hours. He wrote all of this down, every day, the worn leather notebook filling up faster than it ever had. Preston Ashford, meanwhile, had not stopped. In August, he appeared at the county commissioners' meeting and requested that the zoning board's case against Harold be escalated to a formal hearing rather than an administrative review. His argument was patient and well-dressed. The 1931 ordinance existed for public safety reasons. Harold had received a state inquiry noting Africanized characteristics, and the community had a right to a proper proceeding. The commissioner, a man named Dudley Crane, who owed Preston Ashford $11,000 in agricultural loans, scheduled the formal hearing for October 15th. Harold heard about it from Clyde, who had heard it from Dora Phelps, who had been at the commissioners' meeting taking notes for her letter to the county paper. Harold was behind the equipment shed when Clyde told him. He was weighing honey from hive 9 on the catfish scale. He wrote the number down, 94.3 pounds, which was the highest single colony yield he had ever recorded, before he responded. October 15th, he said. That's right. Harold hung the honey bucket back on its hook. That gives me 2.5 months. For what? Harold looked at the 13 hives in their cedar post enclosure. The late afternoon light came through the shade cloth in long parallel strips, and the air inside the enclosure was dense and warm and humming, at a frequency he had learned to read the way some men read faces. To understand what I've got, he said. He tucked the pencil behind his ear, opened his notebook to a fresh page, and wrote, August 14th, 1962. Venom collection, begin formal protocol. He had read, in a 1959 issue of the American Bee Journal, a small article about venom extraction for medical research. The article was 3 paragraphs long and cited 2 European studies. Harold had cut it out and taped it to the inside back cover of his notebook. He had read it perhaps 40 times since then. He read it again that evening by lamplight at the kitchen table, Clara asleep in the next room, the house quiet, except for the sound of moths against the screen door. Then he began designing, in the margins of the notebook page, a simple electrical venom collection apparatus. Glass plate, thin wire grid, 6-volt battery. The bees would sting the glass, deposit venom, withdraw their stingers intact. No bee would die. The venom would dry on the glass and be scraped off with a razor. It took him 3 weeks to build it. It cost him $4.30 in parts from the hardware store in Boston, where nobody asked what they were for. The formal hearing on October 15th lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. Harold sat at a folding table across from 3 county board members, a county attorney, and Preston Ashford, who was not officially part of the proceedings but had been invited to provide community testimony and had brought a folder of documents 2 inches thick. Harold brought his notebook and a manila envelope containing the state inspection report, his 22 years of registered apiary records, and a single letter from Walter Fenn at the Atlanta office confirming that Harold's colonies were within legal parameters at the time of inspection. Preston spoke for 40 minutes. He cited the 1931 ordinance. He cited 3 news articles about Africanized bee attacks in South America. He cited a letter he had personally solicited from a biology professor at Georgia State who had never visited Pearson County and had written 3 paragraphs of general concern about Africanized hybridization that carefully avoided making any specific claim about Harold's hives. Harold spoke for 11 minutes. He read his registration records aloud. He cited the state inspection result. He noted that no citation had been issued. He noted that he had voluntarily reduced his registered count to 19 colonies, below the 30-colony threshold in the 1931 ordinance. He noted that the ordinance itself had never been enforced in 31 years and had no enforcement precedent in Georgia case law. The board deliberated for 40 minutes and issued a decision that satisfied no one. Harold could continue operating his 19 registered colonies, but must submit to quarterly state inspections and must maintain a 100-yard buffer between his hives and the county road. The buffer requirement meant he would need to move his eastern tree-line colonies 60 yards back onto his own property, costing him access to the best natural forage corridor on his land. He accepted the ruling without comment. In the parking lot afterward, Preston Ashford passed Harold without stopping. "Wise decision, Harold," he said, not slowing down. "Compliance is always the wise decision." Clyde was waiting by Harold's truck. He looked like a man who had watched something unfair happen and was still deciding how angry to be about it. "You lost ground," Clyde said. "I moved 60 yards, Harold said. "I didn't lose anything that matters." That winter was hard. Moving the eastern colonies back 60 yards in November meant resetting 32 cedar posts in ground that was already stiffening with cold. Harold did it himself over 9 days, Clyde helping on 4 of them. His hands cracked in the cold and bled at the knuckles, and he wrapped them in cotton cloth and kept working. By December, the colonies were resettled. By January, they were wintering well, better than he expected, the hybridized genetics apparently producing a bee that clustered more efficiently in cold than standard Italian stock. He continued his venom collection behind the equipment shed through the winter, scraping dried venom off the glass plates every 3 days with a single-edge razor. Storing it in small glass vials, he bought 12 at a time from a laboratory supply catalog out of Atlanta. He labeled each vial with the hive number, the date, and the ambient temperature. By February, he had 41 vials. He wrote to 6 universities that winter: agricultural departments, biology departments, 1 chemistry department. He described what he had, carefully and without exaggeration. He included a vial of dried venom with 4 of the letters, wrapped in cotton wool inside a small tin. 5 letters went unanswered. The 6th came back in March of 1963 from a graduate student in the biochemistry department at Emory University named Thomas Wick, who wrote 3 pages in small, careful handwriting saying that what Harold had described was consistent with characteristics of Africanized venom, and that the concentration levels Harold reported were significantly above published norms, and that if Harold would be willing to send more samples, Thomas would like very much to analyze them formally. Harold read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table. Then he wrote a number in his notebook, 41 vials. He circled it. Then he wrote below it, "Send 12 to Emory. Keep 29. Clara looked over his shoulder and read what he had written. "Is this going somewhere?" she asked. Harold thought about it. "I think so," he said. "I just don't know how far yet." Thomas Wick drove down from Atlanta on a Saturday in April 1963 in a green Studebaker with a crack in the rear bumper. He was 26 years old, wore glasses held together at one temple with a twist of wire, and had never been to Pearson County before. Harold met him at the gate and walked him back to the equipment shed enclosure without stopping at the house. Thomas stood at the wire mesh fence and looked at the 13 hives for a long time without saying anything. "How long have they been isolated?" he asked finally. "Since July last year," Harold said. "And the venom yield per colony, you said 3 times standard?" "3 times on hive 7, 2.5 on hive 12, the others range." Thomas pushed his glasses up. "The melatonin concentration in the samples you sent was 43% above published averages for domestic Apis mellifera. We ran the assay 3 times. He paused. "Mr. Grady, do you understand what that means in terms of pharmacological potential?" Harold had read enough in the previous 8 months to have a partial answer. "It means the venom is more biologically active per unit than standard bee venom," he said. Thomas looked at him with the slight surprise of a young academic realizing he is not the only person who has done the reading. "That's exactly right," Thomas said. "There's a small but serious research community in Europe, in Switzerland mostly, that has been studying bee venom as a potential compound in topical therapies, wound healing primarily, but also more recently, skin tissue regeneration." He cleared his throat. "The concentration levels you're producing are significantly above what European apiarists have been able to supply. If your yield is consistent and scalable, what you have here is not a curiosity, it's a supply chain problem waiting to be solved." Harold said nothing. He looked at his hives. "How much can you scale?" Thomas asked. "Depends on how many colonies I can run, and what kind of collection operation I can build," Harold said. "Right now I'm on a 6-volt battery and a glass plate." Thomas almost smiled. "We can do better than that." Over the next 8 months, Thomas Wick drove down from Atlanta 11 times. He brought equipment on the 3rd visit, proper collection frames, laboratory-grade glass plates, a more reliable electrical apparatus that could service 4 hives simultaneously. He also brought papers. European research papers, photocopied and stapled, which Harold read at the kitchen table each night after dinner and annotated in the margins in his small, precise handwriting. The picture that emerged from those papers was specific. Swiss and German cosmetic research chemists had been working since the late 1950s with bee venom as a component in skin cream formulations. The theory was that topical application of very low concentrations of melatonin, the primary active compound in bee venom, could stimulate the skin to produce collagen in a manner similar to the body's response to mild injury, without actually injuring the tissue. The results in small trials were promising. The obstacle was supply. Pharmaceutical-grade bee venom in sufficient concentration and quantity was extremely difficult to source. Harold read this and then sat for a while with his notebook closed in front of him. He was growing something that the world needed and didn't know how to find. He had been growing it by accident for 2 years. He was now growing it on purpose. He began expanding the enclosure behind the equipment shed that fall. 4 new cedar posts, more shade cloth, a second water channel. He increased the collection operation to 8 hives. His vial count by December 1963 was 212. Preston Ashford, meanwhile, had grown quieter. Not absent, quieter. He had won the zoning hearing. Harold had moved his colonies. The community's anxiety about the killer bees had settled into a low background hum, the kind of suspicion that doesn't go away, but stops being urgent. Preston had moved on to other interests, a land dispute with a timber company 2 counties over, a failed attempt to acquire the grain elevator in Waynesboro. But he still watched Harold's farm when he drove past on the county road, and in the spring of 1964, he noticed something that made him slow his Buick to a near stop and look carefully at the equipment shed and the structure behind it. He couldn't see the enclosure from the road, but he could see Harold walking back there in the morning, every morning, going somewhere that wasn't the fields. He drove to the county assessor's office that afternoon and pulled Harold's property records. He spent 40 minutes with the records clerk, asking careful questions. Then he drove home and made 3 phone calls. The letter from the Pearson County Zoning Board arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1965. Harold was behind the equipment shed, scraping venom from the collection plates when Clara brought it out to him. She stood at the enclosure gate and held it up without saying anything. The expression on her face told him what he needed to know before he opened it. The letter was 2 pages. It cited the 1931 ordinance again. It cited a supplementary county health regulation from 1947, another ordinance Harold had never heard of, which stated that any agricultural operation producing biological materials for potential commercial or research purposes must be registered with the county and approved by the health board. The letter stated that Harold's operation behind the equipment shed had come to the board's attention, that it appeared to constitute an unregistered biological materials operation. and that Harold had 30 days to either register the operation and submit to health board inspection or cease and desist entirely. It was signed by the county health board chairman. But the language in the second paragraph, the careful, airless language of a man who had thought about this for a long time, Harold recognized it. He had heard that voice in a Farm Bureau meeting room 3 years ago. He read the letter twice, then he handed it to Clara and went back to his collection plates. He finished scraping, he labeled the vials. He put them in the wooden box he kept under the workbench, lined with cotton wool. He counted them, 289 vials, 3 years of work. Then he walked to the house and called Thomas Wick in Atlanta. "They've found the enclosure," he said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "How?" "Property records. Someone with access and time and reason." Harold sat down at the kitchen table. "They're calling it an unregistered biological materials operation. 30 days to register or cease." "Can you register it?" "I don't know yet. The health board approval process, I don't know how long it takes or what they'd require." Thomas was quiet again. Then, "Harold, I need to tell you something. I've been in contact with a research chemist in Zurich. Her name is Dr. Hannah Rose. She's been working on a venom-based topical formulation for 2 years, and she is very close to a prototype. She asked me last month how much pharmaceutical-grade venom I could supply in the next 18 months. He paused. "I told her I thought we could supply enough. I was thinking about your operation when I said it." Harold looked at the kitchen wall. Through the window he could see the equipment shed, and beyond it the shade cloth roof of the enclosure, and above that the Georgia sky pale and flat with early spring. "If I cease the operation for even 60 days, Harold said slowly, I lose a colony cycle. I lose queen continuity in 4 of the 8 hives. I potentially lose the hybridization line entirely if the queens fail during shutdown." "I know," Thomas said. "I'm not going to shut down," Harold said. Clyde Merritt came over that evening. Harold showed him the letter. Clyde read it, standing at the kitchen counter, still wearing his field jacket, and when he finished he set it down flat and pressed his hand on top of it as if he could stop it from doing damage. "Harold," Clyde said, and his voice had something in it. Harold had never heard from Clyde before. Not quite despair. Something adjacent to it. "They're going to come out here and shut it down. 30 days isn't enough time to register anything with this county health board. Dudley Crane sits on that board. Preston Ashford has Dudley Crane's $11,000 in a loan file at his bank." He stopped. "I don't see a way through this one." Harold looked at the letter. He looked at his notebook, sitting on the table where it always sat. The leather worn soft, the cotton twine spine holding, 25 years of mornings in that book. He picked up his pencil and opened to a fresh page. "I'm going to call an attorney in Macon," he said, "tonight." "On what grounds?" Harold wrote a date at the top of the page, March 9th, 1965. "On the grounds," he said, writing as he spoke, "that the 1931 ordinance has never been applied to any operation in this county except mine. That selective enforcement of an unenforced ordinance constitutes discriminatory zoning, and on the grounds," he paused, writing, "that everything I have done on this property has been done within the boundary of my own registered land, with no complaint from any neighboring property owner except the one who has been bringing these ordinances to the board personally." He finished writing and looked up. "Let Preston Ashford explain to a Macon attorney why he drove to the county assessor's office to pull my property records," Harold said. "Let him explain that on the record." Clyde looked at him for a long time. "That'll cost money." "I know. You've got it?" Harold thought about 289 vials of pharmaceutical-grade bee venom in a wooden box under the workbench, and a research chemist in Zurich who needed an 18-month supply. "I will," he said. The attorney's name was Raymond Caulfield, a 53-year-old man from Macon who had spent 20 years doing agricultural property law and had a reputation in 3 counties for being methodical, expensive, and almost never wrong. Harold drove to Macon on a Thursday and spent 3 hours in Caulfield's office, laying the full history on the table. The 1962 Farm Bureau meeting, the state inspection, the zoning hearing, the buffer requirement, and now the health board letter. Caulfield listened without writing anything down for the first hour. Then he put on his glasses and read every document Harold had brought. Then he took his glasses off. "Tell me about the property records pull," he said. Harold told him about the timing, how Preston had driven past the farm in spring 1964, how the health board letter had arrived in March 1965, and how the county assessor's records would show exactly who had requested a review of Harold's property file and when. Caulfield wrote something down for the first time. "The assessor keeps a request log," he said. "It's a public record." "I know," Harold said. Caulfield looked at him. "You know a lot about public records for a beekeeper." "I've had 3 years to read," Harold said. Caulfield filed 2 motions on Harold's behalf the following week. The first was a formal request to the Pearson County Health Board for a 60-day extension on the cease and desist, citing the complexity of the registration process and Harold's stated intent to comply. The second was a public records request to the county assessor for the full request log on Harold's property file going back to January 1964. The extension was granted. One of the 3 health board members who voted for it was a woman named Ruth Hale, a retired schoolteacher who had read Dora Phelps's letters to the county paper going back to 1962 and had her own opinion about what was happening. The assessor's request log came back within 10 days. It showed that Harold Grady's property file had been requested and reviewed on April 19, 1964 by Preston Ashford personally. Caulfield sent a copy to the health board. He sent a copy to the county commissioner's office. He filed a third document, not a lawsuit, not a formal complaint, but a formal notice of selective enforcement concern, citing the assessor's log and the timeline, and requesting that the health board chairman recuse himself from any further proceedings involving Harold Grady's property on the grounds that the chairman's financial relationship with Pearson County Savings and Trust. Harold's records showed that Dudley Crane's farm carried a $43,000 mortgage with Preston Ashford's bank, constituted a material conflict of interest. The notice was filed on a Wednesday. By Friday, the county paper had a copy. Dora Phelps had been writing letters to that paper for 3 years. The editor knew her name. He called her Thursday evening. She spoke to him for 40 minutes. The story ran on Saturday morning. It named Preston Ashford. It named Dudley Crane. It named the 1931 ordinance and the 1947 health regulation, and noted that neither had ever been applied to any other property in Pearson County. It quoted the assessor's log entry verbatim. It did not quote Harold Grady because Harold had not spoken to the paper. It didn't need to. Harold was behind the equipment shed on Saturday morning when Clyde came running, actually running, which Clyde almost never did, across the field from the road. "The paper," Clyde said, breathing hard, holding it up. Harold looked at it. He read it, standing in the morning light, with the enclosure humming behind him. Then he folded it carefully, the same way he folded everything he intended to keep, and went back to his collection plates. He had vials to fill. The health board held a special session on the first Thursday of April 1965. Dudley Crane did not attend. He had submitted a written recusal the Monday prior, citing in the careful language of a man who has been advised by someone with a law degree a potential conflict of interest. His seat at the session was filled by Ruth Hale, the retired schoolteacher. Preston Ashford was not on the health board. He had no official standing at the session. He came anyway and sat in the back row of the meeting room and did not speak. The session lasted 50 minutes. Raymond Caulfield presented Harold's registration application, which Harold had completed in full over the preceding 30 days with Thomas Wick's help, documenting every aspect of the Venom collection operation in technical detail that clearly impressed at least 2 of the 3 board members. Ruth Hale asked 4 questions, all of them specific and practical. The other 2 members asked none. The vote to approve Harold's registration was 3-0. In the parking lot afterward, Harold stopped to speak with Dora Phelps, who had attended and was writing in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. "Was it what you expected?" she asked him. Harold thought about that. "It was what I'd planned for," he said. "That's not quite the same thing." Silas Bowen was parked across the lot. He rolled down his window and looked at Harold for a moment. "Good outcome," he said. Then he rolled the window back up and drove away. For Silas Bowen, that was a speech. Preston Ashford walked to his Buick without looking at anyone. 3 people in the parking lot watched him go. None of them said anything. They didn't need to. The county paper had already said it, and the assessor's log had said it. And the 3-0 vote had said it in the way that official things say things, quietly, permanently on the record. 3 weeks after the health board session, Raymond Caulfield received a call from the Georgia State Banking Commission. An examiner had been reviewing lending practices at Pearson County Savings and Trust as part of a routine audit, and had noted several loans to county officials, among others, with irregular documentation. Preston Ashford's bank had been using its loan portfolio as a form of social leverage for at least a decade. What had been invisible as long as no one looked was suddenly very visible now that someone had. Caulfield called Harold to tell him. Harold was at the kitchen table with his notebook. "Are you surprised?" Caulfield asked. "No," Harold said. "You knew about the loans?" "I knew that men like Preston Ashford don't keep leverage in their heads," Harold said. "They put it on paper. Paper has a way of ending up where you don't expect. In May of 1965, Harold signed a supply agreement with Thomas Wick and Dr. Hannah Rose in Zurich. It was a modest agreement by the standards of what it would eventually become. 12 months of supply, minimum quantity commitments, a price per gram that Harold had negotiated with Caulfield's help after researching European market rates. The price was, by the standards of anything Harold had ever sold, extraordinary. He was selling bee venom at more than $30 per gram. Honey had been bringing him 60 cents a pound. Thomas drove down on the day Harold signed. They sat at the kitchen table with the agreement between them, and Clara brought coffee. Harold signed his name in the same deliberate way he wrote everything, pressing the pen firmly, moving slowly, as though each letter mattered. He put the pen down and looked at his notebook. The same notebook, brown leather cover, corners worn, soft cotton twine spine that he had replaced 4 times now. He opened it to the entry from August 14, 1962. Venom collection, begin formal protocol. He turned the notebook around so Thomas could read it. Thomas read it. Then he looked up. 3 years, he said. 2 years before that. Before I knew what I was looking at, Harold said. Clara set down the coffee cups and looked at the two of them. So now what, she said. Harold picked up the leather notebook and held it in both hands, the way he'd held it every morning for 25 years. Now, he said, I scale up. By 1968, Harold Grady's operation behind the equipment shed had grown from 13 hives to 61. The enclosure now covered nearly 2 acres, expanded in 3 stages with cedar posts and shade cloth, and the water system rebuilt by a plumber from Barston who asked no questions and was paid in cash and honey. Harold employed 2 men from the county, both of them farmers whose own land had failed in the drought years of '66, teaching them the collection protocol the same way his grandfather had taught him the hive rows, slowly, with demonstration, with the insistence that the notebook was the tool everything else depended on. The supply agreement with Dr. Roos in Zurich had been renewed twice and expanded significantly. By 1967, Harold's venom was being used in a topical serum formulation that Roos's laboratory had been testing in clinical trials. The results, Thomas wrote in a letter that Harold kept in the notebook drawer, were consistent and significant. Skin tissue response was measurable within 6 weeks of application. The formula was moving toward commercial development. In 1969, a cosmetics development company in New York, whose name Harold had never heard until Thomas mentioned it, reached out through the Zurich laboratory to inquire about long-term exclusive supply arrangements. The price they offered was not $30 per gram. It was, by then, considerably more. Harold's attorney handled the negotiation. Harold sat in the kitchen and read the notebook. Preston Ashford's bank did not survive the Georgia State Banking Commission's examination. The commission's full report, released in the spring of 1966, found 14 instances of loans made to county officials and board members that constituted improper influence in regulatory proceedings. The bank was placed under supervision and required to divest its real estate holdings. The process took 2 years. Preston Ashford retained his personal assets and was never criminally charged because the law in Georgia in 1966 was not yet equipped to call what he had done by its right name. But he lost the bank. He lost the grain elevator when the forced divestiture required liquidity he didn't have. He lost the cotton gin operation in 1968 to a buyer from Alabama who paid 50 cents on the dollar. By 1969, Preston Ashford was living in a smaller house on the east side of Barston, and the 2-story brick building on Main Street that had been in his family since 1909 had a new name on the sign out front. Dora Phelps wrote about Harold Grady one final time in the county paper in the spring of 1970. She did not call him a success story. She was too precise a writer for that. She wrote that Harold Grady had spent 8 years being told that what he had on his property was dangerous, worthless, and a problem for the community, and that he had spent those same 8 years learning that none of those things were true and writing it all down in a leather notebook that, she noted, he still carried with him every morning when he walked the rows. Clyde Merritt, who had been there for all of it, read the piece at his kitchen table and then drove over to Harold's farm and found him behind the equipment shed, doing what he always did, walking the rows, notebook in his left hand, pencil behind his ear.
No gloves.
Good piece, Clyde said. Dora's always good, Harold said, not looking up. Clyde leaned on the fence post and watched the hives for a while. The morning was warm. The enclosure hummed at its particular frequency. The one Harold had long since stopped noticing consciously, the way a man stops noticing the sound of his own house settling. You ever think about what would have happened if you'd shut it down? Clyde asked. In '65, if you'd just complied. Harold was writing something. He finished the entry before he answered. "Every day," he said. He closed the notebook. The cotton twine spine had been replaced again last fall, the fifth time, cut from the same bolt of cloth he'd bought in 1961, which he kept on a shelf in the equipment shed because he liked the continuity of it. He tucked the pencil behind his ear and looked at the 61 hives and their 2 acres of shade cloth and cedar post and careful Georgia morning. "A man who complies with a lie," Harold said, "doesn't lose a business, he loses the thing that knew the difference." He opened the enclosure gate and walked in among the hives, the notebook in his hand, the pencil behind his ear. 61 colonies humming around him in the warm spring air. Clyde stood at the fence and watched him go. The way you watch a thing that has arrived at exactly where it was always going, and you understand finally that the journey was the point all along.